On January 7th, 1887, four travelers reached the wide, wind-scoured mouth of Sweetwater Pass just as the sky began to bruise. Snow had not yet begun to fall, but the clouds hung low and gray-green over the Wyoming ridges, and the horses could smell what was coming before the riders could. A single lantern burned on the porch of a squat log ranch house set back from the wagon road, and the yellow light was the only warm color in a landscape that had already turned the color of iron. The ranch was called Halton, though no sign said so. It sat in a shallow bowl of land ringed by cottonwoods and one leaning windmill that had not turned in years. Silas Halton, 71 years old, stood on the porch in a wool coat too thin for the weather, watching the four riders come in one after the other, none of them together, none of them known to him. His wife Martha watched from the kitchen window, her hands still floured from the biscuits she had been making when the first horse crested the rise. Silas raised one hand. It was not quite a wave. It was the gesture of a man who had already counted the beds in his house and knew he had exactly 4 to spare. "Pass will close tonight," he called out. "You'll not make Rock Springs. You'll not make the next station either. You're welcome to the barn, the horses. You're welcome to the table." The first rider to dismount was a woman in a heavy traveling coat the color of wet slate. She introduced herself as Deborah Ainsley, correspondent, though she did not say for whom. Her satchel was heavier than it looked. Inside it, folded twice and pressed flat against a leather notebook, was a Chicago hotel receipt made out to a name that was not Ainsley, and a letter of introduction signed by an editor at the Chicago Tribune who was expecting her to file, by spring, a full account of a railroad land fraud that reached into the office of the territorial governor. She was 33 years old. She had never published under her own name. She intended to. The second rider was a broad, quiet man in his late 50s who gave his name as Patrick Doyle and said he had ridden out of Missouri looking for milder country. He said it flatly, the way a man says a thing he has rehearsed. He wore a plain coat, no badge, no visible weapon, but the coat had been cut with an inside pocket deep enough to hold a folded document, and the document, when Silas took his horse to the barn, brushed against Patrick's ribs and reminded him of why he had come. It was a warrant. Patrick had been a lawman in Missouri for 31 years before his knees quit. He had come out of retirement for this one warrant, and the man named on it was, he believed, already sheltering somewhere in this pass. The third rider called himself Nicholas Brandt, undertaker, of Denver. He was thin, well-dressed, and carried a black leather case that he did not let out of his sight. He spoke softly, apologized often, and had the still, watchful eyes of a man who has learned to make himself forgettable in rooms. He was not an undertaker. The case held no instruments of the mortuary trade. It held a slim account book, bound in oxblood leather, in which were recorded, in a private shorthand, the outstanding debts owed to a syndicate operating out of the French Quarter of New Orleans. Nicholas collected those debts. He had never failed to collect one. The fourth rider was a woman in black, and though her mourning was 8 months old, she still wore it whole. She gave her name as Nicole Ashcroft of Cheyenne. Her husband had been Aaron Ashcroft, state land commissioner, shot dead in the street outside his own office on a bright May afternoon by a man the courts had already acquitted. She carried, sewn into the lining of her coat, her late husband's signet ring, and a single folded page torn from his private ledger. She had not come to Sweetwater Pass by accident. Martha Halton met them at the door with the flower still on her hands and a smile that did not reach her eyes. She was a small woman, 68 years old, with hair the color of ash and a way of moving through her own kitchen as though she were counting the corners each time she passed them. She showed the four travelers where to hang their coats, where to set their bags, where the wash basin stood on the pine sideboard. She did not ask their business. She had lived long enough on the Wyoming road to know that a person who volunteered their business at the door of a stranger's house was usually lying, and a person who did not was usually telling a harder truth. The main room of the ranch house was low-ceilinged and warm. A cast-iron stove burned in the corner, and above it hung a long rifle Silas had carried in the war and had not fired in 20 years. The table was already laid for 6. Martha had known, somehow, that 4 would come. She did not explain how. Deborah noticed it and filed the observation away. Patrick noticed it and said nothing. Nicholas noticed it and smiled softly, the way he smiled at everything. Nicole noticed it last, because she was looking at the walls. The walls were what a newspaper woman would have called ordinary. Squared logs, chinked with clay and horsehair, hung with a few tintypes and one framed sampler that read, in faded red thread, "The Lord is my shepherd." But Nicole was not looking at the sampler. She was looking at the seams between the logs on the north wall, where the chinking, in 3 places, was newer than the rest. She could tell by the color. Fresh clay dried lighter for the first year. These 3 patches were pale as new bread. She sat down at the table and said nothing. Silas came in from the barn stamping snow off his boots. The first flakes had begun to fall while he was seeing to the horses, and now, through the small kitchen window, the yard was already going white. He shut the door behind him and drew the heavy iron bolt across, and the sound of it, small and final, seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet room. "You'll be with us a while," he said, and there was neither warmth nor unwelcome in it. It was a report on the weather. 2 nights, maybe 3. Sometimes a past storm blows itself out by morning. This one won't. "How do you know?" Deborah asked. Silas looked at her for a long moment, and in that look Patrick, who had spent 31 years watching men in interrogation rooms, saw something he did not expect to see in the face of an old Wyoming rancher. He saw a man who had been afraid for a very long time and had learned to hide it inside stillness. "The birds went south 3 weeks early," Silas said. "The elk came down out of the high country last week. My knee, which never lies, has been telling me since Sunday. This will be a bad one." Martha set the last of the biscuits on the table and sat down without saying grace. Silas did not say grace either. Nicholas noticed that. In his experience, ranch families said grace. Ranch families who did not say grace were usually running from something they did not want God to look at too closely. They ate. The wind rose. By the time Martha cleared the plates, the snow against the window had thickened into a moving white wall and the lantern on the porch had gone out. The 4 travelers were shown to their rooms by candlelight. Silas walked ahead with the lantern, his bad knee stiff on the plank floor, and Martha followed behind with a pile of folded wool blankets that smelled faintly of cedar smoke. The ranch house had 4 small bedrooms off a narrow hallway that ran the length of the north wall, and each room held a bed, a chair, and a small table with a chipped enamel basin. There were no locks on any of the doors. Deborah noted this first. Patrick noted it second. Nicholas noted it and did not appear to mind. Nicole noted it and quietly slid the wooden chair from beneath her table so that she could set it against the door when she was ready to sleep. The first night passed without incident. The wind rose to a scream sometime before midnight and stayed there. Deborah lay awake listening to it and writing, in the small leather notebook she kept beneath her pillow, a description of the Halton house that she thought she might one day use. She wrote of the newer chinking on the north wall, though she did not yet know Nicole had seen it too. She wrote of Silas's stillness and Martha's counting the corners walk. She wrote of the 4 chairs already laid out at a table for 6. She did not write any names but her own, and even her own she wrote as D.A., because a newspaper woman traveling under a false byline learns early to leave no evidence in her own handwriting. Patrick did not sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed with his coat across his knees and the folded warrant in his lap, and he read it again by the light of the small candle Martha had left him. The name on the warrant was one he had chased across 3 states over 11 years. The physical description was thin: height, build, eye color, and a single distinguishing mark: a small scar shaped like a fishhook above the left eyebrow. In the lantern light at supper, Patrick had studied each of his 3 fellow travelers' foreheads without seeming to. He had studied Silas's forehead too. He had found the scar on none of them. This troubled him, because the informant who had sold him the tip in Kansas City had sworn the man he was hunting would be in Sweetwater Pass by the second week of January. Patrick blew out the candle and lay down without undressing. Nicholas slept lightly, the way he always slept. His black leather case was under his bed, and beneath his pillow was a small nickel-plated revolver he had carried since New Orleans. He did not think he would need it tonight. His work here would take a day, perhaps two, and then he intended to be gone before anyone in the house understood what had happened. The storm was an inconvenience. It was not, he thought, a catastrophe. He had worked in worse weather. Nicole did not sleep either. She lay in the dark with her hand curled around the signet ring in the lining of her coat, and she thought about the 3 pale patches of chinking in the north wall, and she thought about her husband. Aaron had told her once, near the end, that if anything ever happened to him, she should look for a ranch in Sweetwater Pass. He had not said why. He had not said whose ranch. He had died 3 days later on the sidewalk outside his office, and she had been 8 months learning to breathe again. Downstairs, somewhere in the dark house, a floorboard creaked. Then another. Then silence. Deborah woke at first light to the sound of Martha screaming. It was not a long scream. It was the short, choked cry of a woman who has walked into a room she goes into every morning and found something in it that does not belong. It came from the back of the house, past the kitchen, and it stopped almost as soon as it began, as though Martha had clapped her own hand across her mouth. Deborah pulled on her coat and her boots without lacing them and was in the hallway before the others. Patrick came out of his door a half-second later, moving faster than a man with bad knees ought to move, and Nicholas emerged behind him already dressed, as though he had never truly gone to bed. Nicole was last, and she was calm in a way that Deborah, even in that first moment, thought to remember. The pantry stood off the kitchen, behind a plank door that had been left half open. A thin gray light came through the small window above the flour barrel. Silas lay on his back on the pantry floor, with his throat open from the left ear to the right, and the blood had spread wide across the boards and soaked into the burlap sacks stacked against the wall. His right hand was open beside him, empty. His left hand was closed around nothing. The lantern he had carried into the pantry lay on its side near his boots. It had spilled, but the oil had not caught, because the wick had guttered out sometime during the night. The pantry smelled of kerosene and iron and old flour. Martha was not there. Patrick was the first to speak, and what he said was, "Nobody touch him. Nobody move." His voice had gone flat and professional, the voice of a man who has stood in more rooms like this than he would ever tell anyone about, and for a moment Deborah understood, without being told, that Patrick Doyle from Missouri had not come to Sweetwater Pass looking for milder country. She filed that away too. Nicholas stood in the doorway with his hand resting lightly on the frame. His face wore exactly the correct expression for an undertaker who has walked into an unexpected scene of violence. Grave, sorrowful, slightly professional. It was a very good expression. Deborah, watching him sideways, thought it was too good. Nicole knelt at the edge of the blood, not touching it, and looked at Silas's face. She looked at his hands. She looked at the lantern. Then she looked up and past the others, into the kitchen, and she said quietly, "Where is Martha?" Patrick answered without turning. "That is the question." They searched the house together, all 4 of them, because none of them, in that moment, would agree to be alone in a room with any of the others. They searched the bedrooms, the loft, the cellar under the trapdoor beside the stove. They searched the small side parlor where Martha kept her sewing. They found Martha's shawl folded on the back of her kitchen chair. They found her Bible on the small table beside her bed, open to the book of Ruth, a length of blue thread marking the page. They found her boots by the door. They did not find Martha. Deborah went to the front door and drew back the iron bolt. The wind hit her in the face, and the snow came in around her boots, and she looked out into a white nothing that had swallowed the porch, the yard, the barn, the road, the world. There were no tracks. There could not have been. The wind had erased everything. They stood in the kitchen for a long time after that, Four strangers with the door bolted again and the wind still climbing, and none of them spoke first. Patrick had covered Silas with a wool blanket from the linen chest. There was no point in leaving him uncovered. There was also no point in moving him. The ground outside was already frozen, 2 feet deep, and the pantry was the coldest room in the house. Silas would keep. It was Deborah who finally said it. "One of us did this." Patrick nodded once, slowly. He was standing with his back to the stove, his hands behind him, warming them against the iron. His face had not changed since the pantry. "One of us or Martha," he said. "And Martha is not here." "Martha could not have cut a man's throat and walked into that storm," Nicole said quietly. "She weighed 100 pounds. She was afraid of him." The 3 others looked at her. "You saw that," Nicole said. It was not a question. She counted the corners of the room every time she passed through. A woman does that when she is measuring the distance to a door. Nicholas tilted his head very slightly, the way a man does when a piece of information has surprised him and he does not wish to show that it has. Patrick's eyes moved to Nicole's face and stayed there a fraction of a second longer than they needed to. Deborah, watching all 3 of them, wrote nothing down, but she remembered. "Then where is she?" Deborah said. "Outside," Patrick said. "Somewhere between the door and the barn. She ran, or she was carried." "In her stocking feet?" Nicole said. "Her boots are by the door." Nobody had an answer to that. They agreed, without any of them saying it in words, to a set of rules. They would sleep in their own rooms, they would eat together at the table, and they would take turns preparing what food there was. And they would each watch the others cook. They would not go anywhere in the house alone if they could help it. They would not go outside without telling the rest. Patrick, without offering an explanation, took the long rifle down from above the stove and unloaded it and pocketed the cartridges and put the empty rifle back on its pegs. Nobody objected. Nobody asked where he had learned to do that so quickly. They spent the rest of that first day taking inventory. There was flour enough for 11 weeks if they were careful. There was salt pork, dried beans, a barrel of potatoes going soft at the bottom, 3 tins of coffee, a crock of lard, a wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, and, in the cellar, 6 jars of preserved plums that Martha had put up the previous August. There was hay in the barn for the 4 saddle horses and Silas's 2 mules. There was a wood pile against the south wall of the house that Silas had stacked shoulder high in October, and a second smaller pile inside the woodshed at the back. There was a well in the yard with a hand pump, but the pump handle was already stiff with ice, and Patrick said they would need to melt snow instead. There was, in short, enough of everything for 4 adults to survive until spring, provided that 4 adults were still alive to eat it. That evening they sat at the table for 6, and they ate in silence, and each of them thought, without saying it, that by morning there might only be 3. But by morning there were still 4, and by the morning after that there were still 4, and slowly. Over the first 2 weeks of the storm, the killing that each of them had expected did not come. What came instead was the harder thing, which was time. The wind did not stop. It rose and fell, but it did not stop, and the snow piled against the north wall of the house until it reached the windowsills, and then the eaves, and then the roof. And by the end of the first week, the north side of the house was buried, and the light inside the north bedrooms had gone the pale blue of ice. Patrick, whose bedroom faced north, moved his bedding into the parlor and slept on the horsehair sofa with his coat rolled beneath his head. He said the cold was bad for his knees. Nobody argued. They cooked in shifts. Deborah baked bread on the 3rd morning and did it badly, and Nicole took over the bread after that without a word. Nicholas turned out to be a surprisingly competent cook, and he made a stew of salt pork and beans and dried onion on the 4th night that was better than anything Silas or Martha would have set on that table. Patrick did not cook. He carried wood, and he kept the stove fed, and he watched. They talked, cautiously in the evenings, not about themselves, about the country, about the war in Patrick's case, though only the parts of it that everyone already knew, about Chicago in Deborah's case, though only the parts of it that appeared in the guidebooks. Nicholas spoke of Denver as though he had lived there for years, and his details were correct because he had been trained to make his details correct. Nicole spoke least of all. She spoke of Cheyenne once, of the wide light on the plains east of the town in summer, and then she fell silent, and Deborah saw Patrick watching her, and she wondered what he had heard. The evidence began to surface in small pieces, the way evidence always does when four people are sharing 4 rooms and 1 kitchen and cannot help brushing against one another's belongings. It was Deborah who dropped the hotel receipt. She had folded it inside her leather notebook, and on the 5th evening she pulled the notebook out at the table to make a note about the weather. And the receipt fell out onto the boards. Nicholas picked it up and handed it back to her before she could reach for it. He did not read it. He did not need to. He had already seen, in the half-second the paper lay face up on the table, the letterhead of the Palmer House in Chicago, and a name that was not Deborah Ainsley. He handed her the receipt with a small, courteous smile and said nothing. It was Patrick who left his coat on the back of a chair while he was carrying wood, and it was Nicholas who, passing behind the chair with a plate in his hand, felt the weight and stiffness of the inside pocket, and understood, without needing to look, that there was a folded document inside it that was not a private letter. It was Nicole who, on the 9th day, found the account book. She had gone into the parlor to fetch a candle. Nicholas had left his black case beside the sofa. The case was locked, but the small key had slipped from his waistcoat pocket while he slept there in the afternoon, and it lay on the floorboards, half beneath the sofa's fringe. Nicole did not touch the key. She only looked at where it lay, and she remembered. By the end of the 2nd week, each of the 4 had assembled, in the private ledger of their own suspicions, a small dossier on each of the other 3. None of these dossiers was complete. All of them were wrong in at least one particular. But each of them was correct in the essential thing, which was that the person across the table was not who they had claimed to be at the door. Deborah knew that Patrick was a lawman. She had seen him move too fast in the hallway on the morning of the murder, and she had watched him unload the rifle with hands that had done that 1,000 times. And on the 11th evening, she had watched him refuse a second glass of the plum brandy Nicholas had found in the cellar. And she had understood that Patrick Doyle did not intend to be drunk in this house for 1 hour. Retired ranchers drank. Retired lawmen with a purpose did not. Patrick knew that Deborah was not a correspondent of the ordinary kind. He had watched her write, and she wrote too fast and too neatly, and she wrote in a small private shorthand of her own that he recognized as the shorthand of the Chicago courthouse. He had spent a winter in Chicago in 1879 on the trail of a bank clerk who had run west with a strongbox, and he had sat in the back of that courthouse for 6 weeks watching reporters take down testimony. Deborah's hand was a reporter's hand. Nicholas knew everything, or nearly. He had made his living for 11 years by knowing who was in a room with him, and he had spent the first 4 days of the storm cataloging the other 3 with the patient thoroughness of a man taking inventory of a shop. He had Deborah placed by the hotel receipt and the shorthand. He had Patrick placed by the coat pocket, and the way Patrick's eyes went, sometimes, to the small scar on Nicholas's own left temple, which was not fishhook-shaped and did not match any warrant, but which was, Nicholas knew, the sort of thing a lawman looked for. He had Nicole placed by a small silver clasp on her morning coat that he had seen twice before, in 2 different houses in Denver, and which he knew was made by a single jeweler in Cheyenne who did work only for the wives of state officials. Nicole knew the least, and she knew it deliberately. She had decided, on the 2nd day, that she would learn nothing about the other 3 that she did not have to learn, because she had come to Sweetwater Pass for one purpose, and that purpose did not involve them. She had spent her days walking the interior of the house instead. She had walked every wall, and she had counted every seam, and she had mapped, in the private ledger of her own memory, the 3 pale patches of newer chinking on the north wall, and a 4th she had found on the west wall of the pantry, above and slightly behind the place where Silas Houghton had lain with his throat cut. She did not know yet what was behind the chinking. She had begun to suspect. On the 15th night, the wind fell for the first time in 2 weeks. The house went suddenly, terribly quiet. They all noticed it at once, and they all came into the kitchen without speaking, and they stood at the window and looked out at a moonlit field of snow so bright it hurt the eyes. "It will start again by dawn," Patrick said. He was right, it did. The storm returned before sunrise, and it returned harder, and the fifth week came in on a wind that shook the ridgepole of the ranch house until the tintypes rattled against the wall. It was on the third morning of that fifth week that Nicole went to the woodshed alone. She had told the others she was going. That was one of the rules. She had taken the small hand lantern from the hook beside the back door, and she had put on the heavy sheepskin coat that had belonged to Silas, because her own morning coat was not warm enough for the woodshed, and Patrick had watched her go without comment. The woodshed was a lean-to built against the back of the house, sharing the pantry's west wall. A short covered walkway of plank and canvas connected the back door to the shed. The walkway was choked with drifted snow, and Nicole had to shoulder her way through it, and by the time she reached the shed door, her hair was white to the roots. The shed was cold in the particular way a shed becomes cold when the wind has been finding its way in for 6 weeks. The wood pile inside had been Silas's smaller pile, the one kept for emergencies, and it was stacked 4 feet high against the south wall. Nicole had come for kindling. She had brought the lantern because the shed had no window. She saw the boot first. It protruded from the base of the wood pile at the far end, a small woman's boot, black, laced tight, the toe turned very slightly outward. Nicole did not cry out. She set the lantern down carefully on the packed dirt floor, and she knelt and she began, one split log at a time, to move the wood. Martha Halton had been placed on her side, her knees drawn up, her arms folded across her chest. She had been dead a long time. The cold had kept her exactly as she had been at the moment of her dying, and the moment of her dying had been ugly. There was a dark line across her throat that matched, in every particular, the line across her husband's. Someone had cut her first, then dragged her out through the walkway before the snow had drifted it shut, and stacked the emergency woodpile over her body. Someone had done all of that in the dark, on the first night of the storm, while 3 other travelers slept in 3 of the 4 bedrooms. Nicole sat back on her heels beside the body for a long moment. She was not a woman who wept easily, and she did not weep now. She was thinking. She was thinking that a killer who murders the wife first and hides her body under the woodpile and then goes back into the house and cuts the husband's throat in the pantry and leaves him where he falls is not a killer who acted on impulse. This was a killer who had come to the ranch to do exactly this thing, and who had done the wife first because the wife had seen something, or knew something, that the husband did not yet know she knew. Nicole restacked the wood. She did it slowly, and she did it exactly, log for log, as she had found it. She picked up the lantern. She walked back through the covered walkway to the kitchen door. The other 3 were at the table. She set the lantern down on the sideboard, and she took off Silas's sheepskin coat. And she brushed the snow from her sleeves, and she said, in a voice that was quiet and steady and did not belong to a woman who had just found a second corpse, "Martha is in the woodshed. She has been there since the first night. The killer is still in this house." The rules changed after that. There were no shared meals anymore. Each of the 4 took a portion from the pantry in the morning under the watch of the others and carried it back to their own room, and each barricaded the door of that room at night with the chair, the small table, and in Patrick's case, the horsehair sofa dragged back from the parlor and wedged against his doorframe. They spoke only when they had to. They watched each other cross the kitchen the way men in a pit watch a snake. 2 more weeks passed like that. The snow rose higher on the roof. The woodpile in the main house shrank. Nobody went back to the shed. It was in the 7th week that Patrick made his move. He did it in the middle of the afternoon, in the kitchen, in front of Deborah, because he had decided that whatever was going to happen next should have a witness. He came in from the parlor with the folded warrant in his left hand and his service revolver, which none of them had known he was carrying, in his right. Nicholas was at the sideboard cutting a piece of the hard cheese with a small pantry knife. Nicole was at the stove. "Nicholas Brandt," Patrick said, and his voice had gone into the flat professional register again, The same register it had gone into on the morning of the pantry. That is not your name. Your name is on this paper. Set the knife down. Set it down slowly. Put your hands on the sideboard where I can see them. Nicholas did not turn. He looked at the piece of cheese on the board in front of him for a long, considering second. Then he set the pantry knife down, exactly as he had been told, and he put his hands flat on the wood. "May I see the warrant?" he said, very politely. "You may not. May I know the name on it?" Patrick told him the name. Nicholas smiled faintly at the piece of cheese. "That is not my name," he said. "It has never been my name. You have ridden a very long way for the wrong man, Mr. Doyle." "I have ridden the exact distance," Patrick said. "Turn around." Slowly, Nicholas turned. He turned slowly exactly as he had been instructed, and he kept his hands where Patrick could see them until the very last quarter of the turn, and then his right hand went, in one clean movement that Deborah did not see beginning and did not see ending, from the edge of the sideboard to the small nickel-plated revolver that had been in his waistcoat pocket the entire time. Patrick fired first. He had been a lawman for 31 years, and he was still, at 58, faster than most men half his age, and his bullet took Nicholas high in the left shoulder and spun him half around against the sideboard. But Nicholas fired too, and Nicholas fired twice, and the second bullet went through Patrick Doyle's throat, and Patrick was dead before his knees folded under him on the plank floor. The kitchen was very quiet. Nicholas leaned against the sideboard with his left arm hanging useless and blood spreading down the wool of his coat. And he looked at Deborah. And he looked at Nicole in the doorway to the parlor, and he said, quite calmly, that was self-defense. He drew his weapon. You both saw. Neither woman spoke. Nicholas slid down the sideboard until he was sitting on the floor. The revolver was still in his hand, but the hand was in his lap now, and the barrel was pointed at nothing. I would like, he said, to sit down. I have already sat down. I would like a drink of water. I would like to talk to you both. They did not give him water for a long time. They took the revolver first. Nicole crossed the kitchen, calm as she had been in the woodshed, and lifted the nickel-plated pistol from his lap, while Deborah stood behind her with the pantry knife in her hand. Then they gave him water. Then they bound his shoulder with strips of a torn sheet, because neither of them wanted a third corpse in the house. Then they moved him to the small side parlor, and they locked him in, and the key went into Nicole's pocket and stayed there. The last week before the thaw belonged to Deborah. She sat with Nicholas each afternoon in the parlor, the door open. Nicole always within earshot in the kitchen, and she took out her leather notebook and she asked him questions in the small private shorthand of the Chicago courthouse. Nicholas answered them. He was tired. He was in pain. He had decided somewhere in the 7th week that he was not going to walk out of Sweetwater Pass a free man unless he purchased his freedom. And he had only one thing left to sell. He gave her the story piece by piece, and she wrote it down. Silas Halton had been born Silas Marchand in New Orleans in 1816. He had kept the books of a syndicate that operated along the Mississippi wharves for 19 years. In 1876, he had disappeared with $11,000 of the syndicate's money and a false name and a wife, who was not, in fact, his wife, but a girl the syndicate had also been looking for. They had come north together. They had bought the ranch in Sweetwater Pass. They had hidden the money inside the north wall and the west wall of the pantry, behind 3, then 4, patches of chinking that Silas had mixed and packed himself. The syndicate had been 11 years finding him. Nicholas had been sent in December. But Nicholas had not killed Martha. Silas had killed Martha on the evening of the storm's first night, in the pantry, because Martha had finally understood after 11 years what her husband had done to reach Sweetwater Pass, and she had told him over the biscuits that in the morning she would tell the 4 strangers. Silas had cut her throat with his own pantry knife and dragged her through the walkway and stacked the emergency wood over her, and he had come back into the pantry to clean the knife and hide the blood, and Nicholas had walked in on him doing it. Nicholas had used Silas's own knife. He had left the lantern where it fell. Patrick's warrant, Nicholas told her, had never had any of the four travelers' names on it. It had named Silas Marchand. Deborah closed her notebook when he was finished. She looked at him for a long time. "I will not name you," she said. "You will walk out of this pass alone, in the opposite direction from us, and I will never write your name in any paper anywhere. That is the trade." Nicholas nodded. He had already known it would be. The pass opened in the first week of April. Deborah and Nicole walked out together on a Tuesday morning, leading the 4 horses and the 2 mules. Nicholas walked out 3 hours later, going west, alone, behind them. In the north wall and the west wall of the pantry, Nicole had left nothing. She had taken it all. The story ran in the Chicago Tribune 3 weeks later under the byline Deborah Ainsley. No killer was named. Nicholas was never seen again. Nicole returned to Cheyenne with a deed and a satchel and reopened her husband's case. And in July of 1887, a young family from Nebraska rode into Sweetwater Pass and found an empty ranch and thought themselves lucky and moved in. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of the frontier. And tell us in the comments which of the 4 travelers you suspected first.